Welcome everyone. This is a Globe Op Talk and I am Bina Venkataraman. I'm the editorial page editor of the Boston Globe. And for the uninitiated, Globe Op Talks are conversations between Globe editorial board members and world-leading thinkers, as well as surprising voices you might not have heard from before. And it's a total pleasure today on this historic day on Juneteenth, 155th anniversary of Juneteenth, to welcome our esteemed guest, who is Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He is a professor of history. He is the founding director of Boston University's new Center for Antiracist Research. He is the author of multiple best-selling books, including How to Be an Anti-Racist, Stamped from the Beginning, Stamped, which is a young adult version of Stamped from the Beginning, as I understand it. And this week, he has a new book out as of Tuesday, so he's definitely been burning the midnight oil and joining us at the end of a long week. And his new book is Antiracist Baby, a children's book, which I commend to everyone. So welcome, Ibram. It's so nice to have you here. Thank you for joining us for this Op Talk.
Of course, yeah, thank you for organizing.
So I want to start kind of where I started when you and I first spoke, and that is to ask, well, first to say welcome to Boston, because I know you've already arrived and the center is formally launching on July 1st at BU. But why Boston? Why did you come to Boston?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm thinking like, why not? But I think first and foremost, I was really attracted to Boston University. I was really attracted to the leadership of Boston University and their commitment to really building a center for anti-racist research. And this aspiration did not come about as a result of conversations with me. It was already sort of a conversation that was being had. And I think that obviously, you know, the faculty at BU, there's so many faculty members who are doing incredible research in many different areas, including race. And so that certainly was attractive. And even, you know, a new data sciences faculty, and, you know, data science is going to be one of the pillars of our new center, of course, was attractive, and the university investments in data science. But then I think, you know, the people, like I just got to know so many people in key positions who I had admired from afar and who I was able to really get to know. And then most importantly, the history of BU and the larger Boston area region. And so, and I'm not just talking about obviously Martin Luther King, you know, getting his PhD at Boston University, and 6 months after graduation, leading the Montgomery bus boycott. You know, but even a pioneering Native writer like Charles Eastman, who went to Boston University, or even the first woman to get a medical degree, and I'm married to a woman who is a physician, or even the people's historian, you know, being at BU for quite some time, in Howard's Inn, in the Boston region, as somebody who is African American. And I know the Boston's Black community is one of the proudest and most historic in the country. And sort of thinking through all of the people who come through Boston and lived in Boston, who were Black, and even thinking about the Black people here now who are fighting racism in Boston and across the country, you know, these are the people I wanted to be in communion with. And just as the anti-slavery movement was one of the cradles, if not the cradle, was in Boston, why can't we have one of the cradles for anti-racism in Boston in the 21st century?
So say more about that, because one piece of Boston history that I'm really proud of is the role that Bostonians played in abolition and the early anti-slavery newspapers here, like The Liberator. And I'm just curious, from your point of view, you know, that history is pretty old by now. How does that form the basis for a more modern anti-racist movement? What's the connection you see there?
Oh, it's everything. I mean, even today, you know, we're going to talk about Juneteenth, but, you know, one of the things I think is critically important for us to recognize is there there's a difference between abolishing slavery and freeing people. And abolitionists were critically, centrally involved in the emancipation sort of enslaved people, but the connecting to that was, of course, the efforts to free people, right? To free people of oppression, to free people of racism. And, Black people cannot be free if we're still, of course, subjected to racism. So I see anti-slavery and anti-racism as interconnected and building on each other historically and even sort of currently. And without question, I mean, I think you could probably make a case that Boston's community was the cradle of the abolitionist movement. And not only of abolitionism in the 19th century, you can also make a case it was one of the cradles of feminism through the likes of people like Maria Stewart, or even one of the cradles of literature from the likes of people like Phyllis Wheatley. And certainly you had Maria Stewart, who was speaking out against sexism and racism and slavery, and David Walker, who of course was an incredibly important abolitionist and anti-slavery voice. And that Black community in Boston was critical in the initial financing of the Liberator, of William Lloyd Garrison's voice of abolitionism that ultimately, became the voice of the abolitionist movement, and his work with those Boston Blacks, and their encouragement of him. And even, I mean, I hate to, get too much sort of into it, it was Garrison going to a Black church in Boston in 1829 that caused him to realize he needed to be declaring immediate emancipation from slavery. He had been thinking it was about gradual abolition, but Black folk made it clear to him, no, this is about immediate emancipation.
You're making me wish we were having this conversation at the African Meeting House in Beacon Hill and not via Zoom. I want to flash forward to today, though, and today's Boston, because I think a lot of people who are listening to this, and I have to say it's even in me, have some skepticism about Boston as the seat of an anti-racist movement. We have a reputation among Black people around the country of being uninviting and a racist city. We have a reputation of Black athletes who come here in professional sports being heckled with racial slurs. Our Spotlight series the Globe did a few years ago showed a profound racial wealth gap. The median income of Boston non-immigrant Black families is $8 compared to $247,500 as the median net income for white families in Boston. So the question I have for you is, tell me that the skepticism is unfounded, or how do you see that reality of Boston today fitting with the anti-racist movement that you want to situate here?
Sure, and I'm happy you asked that. And right after we talked about the abolitionist sort of movement and the role that those abolitionists played in Boston, because we can easily speak about William Lloyd Garrison and his role in sort of founding the Liberator, and easily forget that I believe in 1835 he was almost killed by a white mob in Boston who were completely against his activism. And we can easily talk about the role that Maria Stewart played and not talk about that she was chased out of Boston for her beliefs. But that doesn't really take away from what they did. And just as the racism currently in Boston that is reflective of that racial disparity you described doesn't take away from the people who had been fighting against that racial disparity for decades, if not their whole lives. And so for me, I'm always consistently looking for the signs of resistance and the history of resistance in a particular city, and even the people who are involved in that resistance today, rather than whether it has racism. And I'm more concerned about joining a community of people who are involved in that anti-racist resistance today, and I suspect will be involved in it tomorrow. And I will also add that, as someone who's lived in Philadelphia, who's lived in Providence, Rhode Island, as someone who's lived in Washington, D.C., who grew up in New York City, I haven't really lived in a place where I didn't experience anti-Black racism.
Fair enough. I want to zoom out from Boston to the world and just talk about your concepts, hear from you about kind of how you think about what anti-racism is. And I think what's interesting to me is that I know a lot of people, and probably at some stage in my life, I was even one of these people, that if you see the footage of Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer, with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, you say to yourself, I would never do that. I'm not a racist. You tell yourself, when I see KKK members in the robe and the hood, I get the creeps too. I'm not a racist. So I think a lot of people have this point of view that they are not racist. But as I understand it, in your sort of construction of reality, there's not a racist category. There's only racist and anti-racist. Can you say more about that, and why you don't think this sort of not a racist nether category exists?
Sure. So you could have someone who is walking down the street and sees me running down that street and think that I'm running because I just stole something when I'm just jogging. You can have another person who is told to leash up their dog in Central Park and instead decides to call the police and claim they're being threatened by a Black male. Both of those people will then claim, as Amy Cooper did, that they are not racist. Or you can have a police officer knee someone and kill them and then claim he's not racist. And so I think what we see as being consistent along those three is there's sort of multiple levels of, one is just seeing, right? Another is potentially bringing harm, and the other is actually harming. And all three of them based in racist ideas, and all three of them claiming that they're not racist. That is really indicative of the history of not racism, which essentially has been a history of denying one's own race.
You froze for a moment for me, Ibram. I hope not for everyone else.
Is to think that there's something wrong with a particular racial group, or to support a policy that is leading to racial inequity or injustice. Or to be anti-racist is to do very opposite, to believe or to express notions of racial equality, or to support policies that are leading to equity and even justice. And there's really no in-between hierarchy and equality, equity and inequity, justice and injustice.
I want to come back to this idea of the policies, which I think is for me, one of the most profound aspects of your thinking and your work. But for a moment, just to talk about how when you call people either racist or anti-racist, when you say that that's true of us, that you don't think of this as you wrote, it's not a tattoo that you wear for life. It's a peelable sticker that you can take on, or put on or take off, depending on what you're doing at any moment. Why do you think that's important for people to see it as the peelable sticker and not the tattoo? Why is that an important distinction?
Well, I think it's an important distinction because it's the reality. And I think we should consider concepts based in the evidence. And for instance, we talked a little bit about white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who believed on the one hand, the deeply anti-racist idea that slavery is evil and it should not live another day, and spent his career sort of expressing those anti-racist ideas. But what Garrison also said at times is that slavery has separated Black people from humanity, that slavery has literally made Black people into brutes, that basically slavery has made Black people subhuman. And so therefore he questioned during the Civil War whether Black people were ready for their civil and voting rights, and whether they needed a period of civilization. And so when he was challenging slavery and demanding its immediate abolition, he was being anti-racist. If in the same essay or the same op-ed or the same speech, he was also saying these people are brutes, he was being racist. Most people express both racist and anti-racist ideas, support both racist and anti-racist policies. And so then we can't essentially call them racist or anti-racist. We have to state that this is what you are being in any given moment as opposed to who you are.
So when you think about that in the context of building an anti-racist movement, since we are in this moment, we're in this inflection point, or what could be an inflection point where the nation's consciousness is raised, or I should say the non-Black nation's consciousness is raised to systemic issues of racism that have persisted since the founding of this country. How does that idea that opposing racist policies is the way to be an anti-racist, how does that get put into place? How does one adopt that point of view? How does that point of view play into building a movement out of this particular moment?
Sure, the way one adopts that point of view is by one unlearning their racist ideas. Because when we look at all of the racial inequities in our society, like the one you just named in terms of this incredible wealth gap within Boston between Black Bostonians and white Bostonians, there's only two causes of that racial wealth gap. Either there's something wrong and inferior about Black people, meaning they, have made bad financial decisions, they do not want to save. There's something wrong with Black people, again, as a group, or it's the result of past and even present policies. And so once you recognize the racial groups as equals, once you recognize that there's nothing wrong or inferior about any racial group, then you begin to recognize that the true cause of racial inequities and disparities must be racist policies. And again, I just want to emphasize that I'm not stating that there are not Black individuals who make bad business decisions, or Black individuals who aren't lazy, or Black individuals who are not financially, not making financially sound decisions, but there are white individuals like that too. There are Native individuals like that too. There are Asian and Latinx individuals like that too. And no racial group has a monopoly on any of those sort of behavioral traits. And if anything, there's this gradation within all racial groups, but still some have more. And it's not because they are more. And when we recognize that, we then start to then look at, okay, what policies could be behind this disparity? And then obviously we become a member of those people who are trying to figure out what policies those are and change those policies.
So is that part of your prescription for how we keep this from being an ephemeral moment? Because we have seen there have been past protests around all kinds of issues of inequity in our country. And I'm just wondering how, what's the next step, both for the people who've been in the streets marching alongside, Black Americans claiming Black Lives Matter. What's the next step to become truly anti-racist, to actually support the movement that you are driving and trying to build?
Well, it's policy change. And so how an individual can become involved in policy change obviously is different with every individual, but there are organizations, there are centers, there are campaigns, there are policymakers who are focused on anti-racist policy change. And then the question becomes for every individual, how do you not only demonstrate that racism is a problem on the streets, not only learn about racism through reading books in your own home, but how do you how do you support those organizations, those centers, those policymakers, those campaigns that are seeking to strike down and replace racist policies, and it's different for every individual. And so what I mean by that is, you know, some individuals may have a lot of time on their hands, so they can actually join and volunteer for a grassroots organization, and their time is going to be so valuable to that organization. Other folks may have some sort of platform that they can use to really elevate these campaigns in these organizations. Others may have resources so they can fund these organizations, these centers, these policymakers. The question for every one of us is, what do we have to give? What is our expertise? You know, and think about that. I mean, I grew up in the church, in the church, and in the church, you know, especially in the Black church, every sort of member is asked, okay, what can you give to the church? Like, what is your expertise? Can you sing? Okay, join the choir, right? Can you preach? Okay, get up there on the pulpit. You know, what can you give to this larger community? And I think that's the same question that every individual can be asking themselves.
So we're in the middle of this pandemic, and you've talked about how the health disparities between Black America and the rest of America, for that matter, people of color in America and white America, are profound and an example of racist policy. So what would an anti-racist set of policies that could have either prevented the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, people of color, or that can now deal with the health impacts we're seeing in those communities, what would that look like? What would the anti-racist policy look like for this pandemic?
Sure. So one study found that what was actually more predictive of, and I'm just going to give one example with Black people, that what was more predictive of Black infection and death rates than pre-existing conditions was employment status, access to high quality healthcare, access to health insurance, and the air and water quality of one's neighborhoods. And so then how do we transform policies to ensure that Black people are not more likely to be concentrated in neighborhoods that have polluted air and water? How do we transform policies to ensure that there's not this sizable gap between the number of Black and Latinx people who are insured and the number of white people who are insured? How do we eliminate that problem from the situation? Would be an anti-racist policy in which everyone has health care. It's a human right. Obviously, when it comes to access to high quality health care, not everywhere in the country is like Boston, in which you have a hospital on seemingly almost every block. And so how do we make every area in the country like Boston, in which you have a hospital on seemingly at every block? And you know, and then finally, employment status. You know, why is it that Black and Latinx people are less likely to be in jobs in which they are able to work from home? And what policies can we put in place that ensures that Black and Latinx people are not being herded into service industries and denied into more professional industries that allow them to work from home? What is preventing that? What is it? The pipeline in highly selective universities? Is it the way in which these companies and institutions consider people to be qualified? You know, what is that? And those are things that we need to study. And those are things we obviously need to change.
Thank you for that. In just a moment, I'm going to invite my colleague Marcela Garcia to join us to give us audience questions. But before I do that, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a bit more as a historian on this day about Juneteenth. So we're actually seeing a number of efforts, corporations declaring it a holiday, obviously states like New Hampshire that have already created a holiday around today and this commemoration. The bill that Senators Harris and Booker are introducing in Congress to declare this a national holiday. What's your view on this? I mean, is this, you know, tokenism? Is it merely symbolic? Is it an important thing to be doing? Is it an actual driver of change?
I suspect for different people, I think it's different for different people in terms of why they're doing it, right? But I do agree that Juneteenth should be a national day of mourning, or a national holiday, or a national day of reflection, a national day of seeking to repair. I mean, when we think of the evil of slavery, I don't know of any other word to use, but that's what Boston abolitionists used to describe it, and how this evil lasted for so long, and how the wealth of this country was largely derived from that evil, and how even the wealth of many people in Boston who were receiving some of those cash crops being grown in the South, and putting them in factories, which then provided employment. I mean, these are all things we need to know about. These are all things we need to remember. These are all things that we need to be sure that we're repairing from, because the fact of the matter is, people act like, well, I wasn't involved in slavery, and so why is that something I even need to remember or be involved in or learn about? I mean, as if um, as if this is not American history. I mean, like one of the singular stories that define American history, that distinguish American history from the histories of other nations is slavery. And so I think it's critically important for us to do something every year with this day. I'm not sure necessarily what that something is, but I certainly think that every American should have a very deep and thorough knowledge about slavery. And I'm struck by how little most Americans know about slavery. And it's something that we need to be teaching. Its legacy is something that we need to be teaching, and we need to be constantly seeking to repent and repair from slavery.
Thank you for that. And I also am just noticing that as you've talked about Juneteenth, you've talked about it as a time of mourning, and not necessarily as a time of celebration, which I've heard other people sort of talk about that. And is that because you see it as a delay in fulfilling the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation? Is it because we have to focus on the reason for it to begin with? Why is it a day of mourning?
So I think for me, I have mixed feelings about Juneteenth. I think on the one hand, it is a day of mourning, and on the other hand, it is a day of celebration. And I think it's not hard for people to understand why it's a day of celebration. All of the people, particularly in Texas, who finally heard the news after it had been held to them for so long that chattel slavery was no more. But at the same time, it's a day of mourning, not just mourning the violence and the brutality and the death that literally sustained slavery. I mean, this was an institution that was sustained through torture and violence and terror. And there's no, I mean, there's no other way to sort of describe it. And I think that's something we need to know. We need to know that so we never replicate it, and so we can sort of understand our past. But then also, Black people are still not free. And I think it's a difference, as I mentioned earlier, there's a difference between abolishing slavery and freeing people. Black people were told, okay, now go and work for your former masters. And they were told that that's freedom. They were told that you're free now, even though you don't have civil and voting rights. Or when they got civil and voting rights, they were snatched from them, from Ku Klux Klansmen and others who were voter suppressing. But then they were said, well, you're still free. Black people had worked land for decades that allowed other people to get rich. And then when they were quote, freed, they were left landless. And then they were told that they were free. And the disparities that then emerged in post-war America persist to this day.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite at this moment Marcela Garcia to join us. Marcela is an editorial board member at the Globe and a columnist as well, and she's going to share with us some of the burning questions from the audience. Thanks, Marcela.
Hi, thank you, Bina. Hi, Dr. Kendi.
Hey.
Thanks for joining us, and hello, everyone. Dr. Kendi, we received a few hundred questions, not just from people here in Boston, but from all over the country. And there were obviously some key themes. One of them was that people are really interested and invested in participating in an anti-racist movement right now. So on that note, here's the first question. I'm white. I am concerned about inadvertently saying or doing something that is unhelpful or even disrespectful. How can white communities help Black communities without falling into the old stereotype of whites as savior and people of color as those that need to be saved?
I think for white Americans to confront the very racist ideas that are at the bottom of white savior mentalities, that are at the bottom of racist paternalism, and even, you know, the idea of I want to be involved, but I don't want to harm. I think the way in which you can learn what is helpful and what's harmful is not only sort of talking to people of color, but even more importantly, studying the history of racism. And the reason why I say more importantly is because not every person of color is an expert on racism. And not every person of color is even an expert on their race. They can, of course, share their own personal experiences, which they are an expert on, but they may not be able to really share with you the history of racism or the way racism operates in any city. And so, but there are people who are studying this, who are writing books on this, who are writing essays and op-eds on this. And those are the materials in which you need, so you can figure out what's helpful and what's not.
Great. We also received a few questions, more than a few questions from people working in public schools as educators, white teachers who have, you know, a majority of Black students in their classrooms, folks actually in the Boston public schools worried about not having a sufficiently inclusive and anti-racist curriculum. So I wanted to ask you this question from someone in the Boston Public Schools. What are some ways local Boston Public Schools can reach out and work with you at this center at BU?
That will be happening. We'll figure that out.
Good. Again, there was a lot of interest, and I hope that happens. There was, I just want to mention real quick, this white teacher that has, again, a classroom full of Black students, and for the first time, she decided to scrap the, you know, what her curriculum was saying and spent the day, instead of talking about bees, they started talking about racial issues, and she felt that that was like the most engaged her class had ever been. But I hope that happens too. I wanted to let you know that there's a lot of interest from the Boston Public Schools staff and teachers to work with you. You also mentioned another—
And I should say, I think I have a meeting coming up with Boston Public Schools. So this is going to happen sooner than later.
Great to hear. Another question is, you were mentioning about Juneteenth, about it being a day of mourning and a day of reflection on how to repair. Another question that we got is about reparations. And the question is, how might reparations work? And are there alternatives to reparations that would be effective? And how would they be implemented?
Many different ways that reparations could be implemented, and you know, as a scholar and as someone who really likes to speak from the data, what I think many people are calling for is for us to study that, right? I mean, that's what people actually want to do. Congress, you've had congressmen and women who've been calling for the ability to even study this question for decades. And so I want to call the attention to that, because we don't have to answer that. That's not the first question. I should say, no one should decide, okay, you're gonna have to tell me first how reparations are gonna be implemented before I decide, my political position on it. Don't you think it should be best that we research the topic, figure out the best way to implement reparations, and then you can then see the potential impact, the potential cost, and then you can sort of make a decision. Then I think that's a better place for all of us to be deciding on reparations. And I would also add that we have a growing racial wealth gap in this country. Before the current recession, forecasters were estimating that by 2053, Black median wealth is projected to redline at $0. And between now and then, white median wealth is projected to grow. So then the question becomes, how do you, for those who claim they're committed to racial equality, how do you reverse, let alone eliminate, that growing racial wealth gap without a program like reparations?
So here's the last question, and it's sort of a different question. What are your self-care practices that have most helped you balance out the fatigue from emotional labor in anti-racist work?
Sure. So I don't want y'all to think I'm like a health nut, but I am a vegan. And so ever since I turned to veganism, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, it's just been, it's done wonders for how I've felt physically, and even my emotional health, and even something as simple as like it's cleared my skin. But so I'm a vegan. I also exercise like 5 times a week. And so I typically center myself in the morning through that. And then I also try to find joy in the smallest of things. And even, if I give a talk, a lecture, I'm not just going to, I may crack a few jokes every now and then, right? Because I do think that we should still be able to find joy, in the midst of even a horror story. And that's one of the things that gets us through.
True. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kendi, and I apologize to everyone who is submitting questions and submitted questions. We unfortunately only have limited amount of time. We hope we can have you for the whole day, but that's obviously unreasonable. So thank you so much. Over to you, Bina, now.
Marcella. And thanks everyone for submitting so many brilliant questions. I had a chance to look at some of the great ones that came in over the last couple of days. This conversation about joy is making me think about something that you've talked about and written about that has moved me. And I think it's maybe somewhat surprising because you talk about being an anti-racist, and there's a good reason for that you've explained to all of us today. But you have said that one of the things that drives you is actually love. And can you talk more about that?
Sure. So first and foremost, I define love as a verb. And simultaneously, as you can see, I view being anti-racist as an active sort of thing. And so it's not that somebody can just stand up and say, I'm anti-racist, or just like, I don't say to people that I'm striving to love through my actions that I love you, meaning I want them to see and feel my love on a regular basis. And so one of the ways in which I'm seeking to express my love to Black people is through fighting against racism that is affecting them. I seek to show my love to all of humanity by fighting against bigotry, which I consider to be one of the 3 lethal weapons threatening human existence, along with climate change and nuclear war. And I'm fighting from love. I just find so much joy and laughter, and there's so much beauty within humanity. within human diversity, within human creation. And that's what I want to flower rather than the misery that comes through racism and other forms of bigotry. And it pains me to see people who are feeling and facing that misery because I love them, because I love human beings. And I think we need to really lean into, love in a very active sense, so that we can ensure that we are being loving towards humanity. Or if you don't really care about humanity, but you care about your loved ones, your family members, your children, your parents, then I think even for them, it's critically important for us to fight against bigotry and fight against racism in particular, because we should be able to see how and why, and I constantly sort of show in my work how and why we can create a better Boston, a better world, if we're willing and able to do the hard work of anti-racism.
Thank you so much for that. I want a few more minutes of your time since we have it, even though that was a pretty powerful statement that I want to give space to as well. Can you give us, I know you're going to be making a big announcement, a launch of this center on July 1st at BU. Can you give us a preview? You've said a few things about your collaboration with Boston Public Schools, but give us a bit of a sneak preview of your vision for what this center will do.
Sure. So I think one sort of way to understand it is we want it to be like an intellectual factory for anti-racist policies and even narratives, or to think about it even more broadly. I think I've mentioned how, once we realize that the problem isn't people, that the problem is policies, then we have to figure out, okay, what are the policies that are leading to these racial inequities? And that's not an easy thing to do, and it's not the type of thing in which one person with one form of expertise can sort of understand typically why those inequities exist. And so one of the things we want to do is do what is often done in the sciences, in which you have problem-centered research approaches in which you bring people from different forms of expertise, create these multidisciplinary sort of teams who can research together the same racial problem, trying to really understand the policy causes of a particular racial inequity, understanding even that racial inequity and all of its manifestations and intersections, so that we can have that research basis to innovate or even identify anti-racist policies that can essentially reduce or eliminate that racial inequity. And so we want to build these research and policy teams that include researchers led by BU faculty, who are in conversation with people who can develop policies based on that research, and even people who can do narrative work around that problem and solution, and even people who we can work directly with advocates and policymakers to institute those policy sort of innovations. Because one of the things I found being in the academy as long as I've been in it, as if I've been in it for 50 years, but is that there's so many great scholars. There's so many great researchers at BU and even around this region who do what they do best, which is research. And I want research to be at the foundation of policy change, so that we institute evidence-based sort of policy correctives. And we're also sort of planning to do is build a racial data lab, in particular, that really seeks to use and leverage and collect and present data, racial data, that already exists, to ensure that even these larger conversations we're having over race, we're again basing it on the data. We're doing that now with the COVID racial data tracker, which is the premier and most comprehensive tool available and site available for collecting and presenting race and ethnicity data on COVID-19, we want to sort of broaden that as well. Let me stop there because I can go on and on, you know, about our plans, but centrally we want to really bring together specialists to really use research and even intellectual or innovative sort of policy creation, and you know, so that can come to bear on the seemingly intractable racial problems of our time. And we need people's help. We need the help of people who are going to support our center. We need certainly the researchers who are going to be involved, the students who are certainly going to have a role, and we're excited about this.
I could listen to you talk about the bridging of scholarship and practice all day, but I know you don't have all day. I do want to ask you if you have a moment for one more.
Sure.
I do want to ask you about this because you're a scholar grounded in empirical evidence. The research, the data lab that you talked about clearly are guiding your vision and your work and what you'll be doing, which we're all very excited to witness and support. But you also are a man of faith, and you were raised by Black liberation theologists. And I want to kind of draw on both the scholar and the person of faith to ask this question, and to ask you, do you really think it's possible? Do you think that in a couple of decades, American society can become truly anti-racist?
So in 1831, when William Lloyd Garrison published his first editorial in the Liberator from Boston, and stated that, and I'm paraphrasing him, that slavery should not live another hour, that slavery is evil and it needed to end. And he, of course, paraphrased the words that Black people had been saying from Boston and other cities for decades. People thought he was out of his mind. People thought it was crazy. People thought that, no, slavery is going to, slaveholders are so powerful, so wealthy, there's just no way that chattel slavery can one day be no more. And so on this day, as we're sort of celebrating, in addition to mourning, the abolition of slavery, I think it's critically important for us to remember that history, that those people who believed that change was possible, those Bostonians who believed that change was possible, Americans thought that they were crazy. Americans thought that they were out of their mind. And because many Americans were deeply cynical. And I think what they realized, like all change makers have realized throughout human time, is that you have to believe change is possible in order to bring it about. Even when the odds are completely against you, even though people are telling you you're crazy for thinking the impossible, you have to believe that. And this isn't really just about believing that we can create an anti-racist America. This is about believing in anything, right? Anything new, you have to believe it's possible in order to create it. And so I certainly believe that change is possible because I know I have to believe that in order to bring it about.
Thank you so much, Ibram X. Kendi, everyone. And thank you for everyone who joined this Op Talk. If you like what you saw, we have more Globe Op Talks coming up, including one with Dr. Paul Farmer, the founder of Partners in Health, on Monday, one with Oscar award-winning filmmaker Errol Morris on Thursday. So come back, and thank you again to our wonderful guest.
You're welcome. Thank you.